Hello, I'm Jake Stone, and we welcome you to another episode of Generally Particular, which is a production of the London Lyceum, but this is not our normal Generally Particular. This is another installment of the Quartet. So I'm joined with Jesse, Casey, and Winston. And today's topic is sure to be clickbait material because I've entitled the episode Religion and Politics, the two things that you should never talk about to strangers. But we'll talk about it here in the Quartet. And specifically, we want to kind of talk about in Baptist life, how do we understand the difference between conservatism and populism? But before we begin our episode today, let's just do a quick around the horn. How is everyone doing on this September the 4th, 2025?
I'm doing pretty good.
Doing great.
Doing good. Hey, I just
Gosh.
finished up the Baptist Ecclesiology class, so I was channeling my inner Jake Stone today.
No, because you were trying to instruct them about the way that Baptists can have bishops as messengers. So yeah,
We're not there. We're not there yet. We got to get to the
It takes time.
1650s. Yeah, we're still in the Hellwist period, so we haven't gotten to the Baptist bishops yet.
Wait a minute, aren't you? This is your second class. You should be in Acts. Week
Yeah,
one was the Gospels. Then you go to Acts.
We actually never move out of Acts for
Yeah.
the whole time.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, Casey is down there giving us his best J.R. Graves impersonation today and landmarkism.
Well, I actually just trimmed my beard, so it was longer, Jake.
Wow,
So this
man.
is actually the trimmed up version.
And
It's looking good.
Winston identifies for us the seeker sensitive pastor.
That's
He
right.
looks like Matt Chandler. So yeah. So all right. So we're going to be talking about today, guiding this conversation will be portions of Religious Freedom, a Conservative Primer by Dr. John D. Wilsey. Let me just tell our audience, because I know people were, I was told through the grapevine that some people wanted to know, would I and Jesse in our next podcast say anything about college football? Let me go ahead and say that this is a serious program that is devoted to intellectual development. And I'm counting down to basketball season. That's where I am. Because baseball has been horrible as a Braves fan. Alabama brought me back to my childhood of when getting to the Independence Bowl was considered a miracle. And that's where we are this year, looks like. And so I'm on, Bill Belichick, he didn't have a great opening weekend either. Famously said, on to Cincinnati. Well, we are on to basketball in my heart. And for all of our audience, you will love to know that Dr. Wilsey, who is a big Georgia fan, spent a good bit of our class time this week letting me know about the results from this past weekend. So, having said that, we move on to discuss weightier topics: populism, conservatism, and how does that play in Baptist life a little bit? So I want to begin this conversation with this statement from Dr. Wilsey. The rightism of contemporary times is populist, obsessed with politics, and fueled by social media-inspired outrage in a similar style as their leftist counterparts. The American right has thus far failed to conserve American ideals, Western civilization and culture, and religious values and liberty. Now, I think that is definitely true in the scene on the American right, that there is very much this unbridled populism that Dr. Wilsey said in seminars, much like the left, that both of them just complain and whine all the time. And there's not really much of a positive or constructive vision. My question to the three of you is, number one, do you agree with this statement? And number two, how do you see these forces not just at play in the American right, but specifically, broadly speaking, in Baptist life? Let's start with you, Casey, because you're the expert in this field.
Okay. That's a big question. I mean, obviously, I think you can see this dynamic playing out all the way through history. So this isn't a new thing. I mean, you go back, my particular area of study has been a Jeffersonian period and Baptists of that era, particularly Baptists in Kentucky. And populism was a huge thing at that time as well. And so this is, in fact, you could kind of see Jeffersonianism and populism growing side by side. as Baptists in America began to get rid of their dependence and reliance on confession of faith. Ecclesiology begins to drop. Movements like the Campbellites come into Kentucky. 1/3 of Baptists go into this movement, which was a huge populist movement. You could say Campbell out-populist the populist in some sense. And so, yeah, I mean, I think this is always a struggle. There's always a tension here. I know, Jake, you and I have talked about this before of, it's a spectrum, right? It's not populist or not, but it's how far populist do you go, and what guardrails do you put up to guard against the worst abuses of it?
Okay.
One of the things that Wilsey says in his book is that conservatism is pre-political. So the impulses that we see, the values we see within conservatism is actually pre-political. It's prior to thinking about politics. And one of the things that I think you see that when the Baptists have done this well, when our political engagement has been done well, we're not first and foremost political beings in the sense of being involved in the political process. We don't abdicate involvement in politics, but we don't see that as our primary place of involvement. And so we want to see cultural transformation and change. And we see that happening not exclusively, but maybe primarily through conversion. What does it do? What good does it do to have political transformation without spiritual transformation? There could be some value in it, but it wouldn't go far enough. That's kind of part of the problem that I think Wilsey is pointing out, is we seem to see in some populist movements, even among those who would say that they're Christians or Baptists, they see politics as the primary instrument to bring about transformation and change. So we want to be, politically engaged and to be involved in what's going on in our communities and in our nation. But being conservative means being conservative is a pre-political sort of thing. And I would say as a Baptist, remembering the centrality of evangelism, but also the life of the church in cultural transformation. And then politics as being somewhat downstream from that.
Yeah, I think of Russell Kirk's famous 10 principles of conservatism, and the way in which historically conservatism is something more of an attitude or a disposition rather than a political ideology. I think that the way the word gets thrown around now, you're progressive or conservative, liberal or conservative, is a word that we use to identify, a certain partisan approach to politics or particular political ideology. But what I've always appreciated about conservatism is the way in which it appreciates that there are things that are much more fundamental to partisanship, partisan politics, and that the extent to which we try to reduce those other areas of life to that, it impoverishes us culturally and morally and spiritually. I wouldn't ever go so far to say that, like, historically conservatism has always reflected Christian instincts. I certainly wouldn't say that it's inherent to the gospel or something like that. But I do think that in many ways it does reflect an appreciation for an understanding of the human nature, moral order, and things like that, that provide an adequate framework for engaging in politics. And I think that's why for me, and maybe this is just anecdotal, but for me, I don't see as many truly traditionally conservative people as angry or fearful as I find populist conservatives, because I do think that there's the fact that they haven't reduced all of life to this means that they can engage it with a certain level of freedom and patience that we just don't find very often now in what gets branded as conservatism.
Yeah, I think you're articulating one of the big points that Wilsey's arguing in this book. He's arguing for what he calls aspirational conservatism. And there's a hopefulness to this, and it's principled. And, you said you wouldn't say that conservatism's like inherent in the gospel or anything, but I do think if you're drawing a Venn diagram, there's a lot of overlap, in terms of the fact that conservatism's teaching us to value tradition, to be thankful for tradition. It's teaching us that there are certain timeless universal truths that are worth conserving and that should be carried forth through every epoch of history. And so in that regard, I think that, there are some close ties and parallels to Christianity, to the Christian faith.
So let me throw this one out there to y'all, and let's think about it as we're using these terms. Historically, in Baptist life, though, if we were in the 17th century, would you have called Baptists conservatives or radicals?
I would call them conservatives.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, there is a radical maybe component in the sense that maybe they aren't after, slow or what we might call evolutionary change. I do think they want to see quick transformation. You see this in the earliest Baptists, and that's why they're willing to argue for these things even when it costs them. But conservative in the sense that I think that primitivist impulse of going back to the New Testament is a conservative impulse in the sense that they think that what's happened is that the church has deviated from its past. It's abdicated, it's given up on much of the past in the early church and even the earliest centuries of the church. So that's a really complicated question. I think that's a really good one. And so I'd like to hear what Casey and Winston have to say. But I do think that the element there of primitivism as essentially conservatism, in other words, it's not based on some sort of utopia in the future. The idea is that there's something back there that we need to get back to. And it's ultimately the teachings of Christ and the apostles.
Yeah, I think if we're using conservative in a very generic sense to just mean conserving, the current structures and things that are in place, then obviously the Baptists are pretty radical. There's a reason we're called the radical reformers, especially in terms of our political theology, because it was quite a revolutionary idea that they were proposing. But if you think about some of those principles of conservatism, one of the key ones being an emphasis on the restraint of power. What religious community in the modern West would be most positioned to appreciate the importance of restraint on power than those against whom the sword had been wielded, in the name of religion? And so, I think there are certain elements there with impulses and priorities within the early Baptist tradition that you see aligned with some of those conservative principles, like the restraint of power and the emphasis on voluntary cooperation and so on.
Yeah, I think the early Baptists, I mean, if you go back and look, I'm always interested in the citations or the allusions that Baptists make to Constantine and his conversion, and like this idea that was some great compromise. I think, the most extreme version of this is that's like the second fall, um,
It was.
but yeah, but again, that's a conservative impulse to try to look back, even in history, to try to go back and say, okay, at some point this went wrong, and we're trying to right the ship. We're seeing where the political power and the power of the church became intermixed, and corruption was the result of that. And we want to go back beyond that and find, back before that corruption took place and get back there.
So
And
here's
maybe
what
part of the argument is that Roman Catholicism and even Protestantism in the Church of England, that is what was truly innovative. That's what was truly revolutionary. I mean, the way that they frame it is we're not innovative. We're trying to go back to the teachings of the apostles and what we find in the New Testament and what we find in the earliest church, where they see innovation and maybe not revolution necessarily, but innovation is in Roman Catholicism and the Church of England.
So the reason I ask that is because I think about from that period, if I think about the term, radical in the sense that the Baptist view on who is a part of the church, how that connects to the state. I mean, it was a radical upheaval of the established order. So they were radical conservatives. Now, the reason I'm asking that is because in the early 20th century, men like E.Y. Mullins, W.O. Carver here at Southern, both at Southern, L.R. Scarborough at Southwestern, these early 20th century Southern Baptist leaders call themselves progressive conservatives. And their whole mission in this early 20th century was about building efficient denominationalism, institutionalizing the convention in a sense. But they were facing a lot of pressure points from the more unbridled populist elements embodied in somebody like J. Frank Norris. And I think a question that I want to ask, though, is that you think about that time period, early 20th century, the striving of building, I wouldn't say Southern Baptists were, but that movement of a progressive utopia. Do you get this sense as we're all being exposed to these more populistic elements on the right? Do y'all think that the danger here of populism is that it is, in a sense, like progressivism in believing that we can somehow achieve a utopian society if we just do A, B, and C? Now, one could argue they have a different way of getting to the end result, but do you think that they both are trying to bring about something that's going to be the ultimate? Does that even make sense?
It makes sense. I'm having to think about it though, Jake. I
Okay.
mean, I don't have a quick answer for you on this one.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah, I think about how surely their own thinking had to reflect, that optimism of the late 19th, early 20th century, which is completely demolished by 2 world wars, a subsequent Cold War, and all of that. And I do wonder, if there wasn't a certain level of of idealism or utopianism that came along with that. I mean, when you look at the numbers of the first half of the 20th century, the explosion in attendance, the influx of money, I think it makes sense that some of them at least would get a little intoxicated on that and kind of maybe expect a little too much.
Let me phrase it this way. One of the things that struck me in a recent book on the transformation of the SBC from 1919 to 1925, the 75 million campaign, the establishment of the cooperative program, the establishment of the executive committee, making the SBC an efficient denomination, is to me the mindset that those men had, and they're getting caught up more in this New South progressive, not in the sense of what we think of as progressive today. I'm not at all, but it's this, we've got to get past the antebellum period, Reconstruction, building a new society. Is that when you listen to the way they would talk about things and why we've got to do this, these programs, this money, this fundraising, and all of that, and then you listen to people that are on the populist right, it's as if both of these mindsets totally forget that man is depraved and corrupt, and that just having better institutions or capturing institutions is not enough. And it does, I would argue, then strike at the core of Baptist identity, which has been individualistic, not in a libertarian sense. That's a corruption of that, but did believe that each person must be born again. They must experience the new birth. And that's the way that change really happens, is it begins from within with a person. And so both of these kind of, different philosophies totally fail to understand or grasp what it means when we say that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And that just having institutions or better institutions or new institutions is not the answer. It's not the solution.
Yeah, I mean, the irony of all the talk about the populist talk about a new Christendom and, magisterial theology or whatnot. I mean, there's such an amnesia about history that you're saying a new Christendom because we've tried this, right? I mean, like it didn't work and it hasn't worked. And if you look at the nations where it's strongest, where that was most prevalent, they're the most secular today. So yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, I think Winston made a great point about, obviously the period you're referring to got sobered naturally, from historical circumstances and wars. But it's just interesting. But I think what you're saying, that this point you're making, is to me why modern conservative populism is not really conservative. because you're not learning the lessons you're not looking back and noting history. You're not taking into account the depravity of human beings. Human nature doesn't change. And so, if that's not going to all of a sudden work now.
Yeah, and that's why it seems problematic that so much emphasis is placed on taking over institutions. And even the magisterial Protestantism conversations, rarely are they ever about conversion. They're really often about control, right? Taking over institutions, taking our nation back, putting Protestantism at the center, getting a new sort of Protestant ruler. There's this section in Wilsey's book where he talks about this a little bit, and I think it's really helpful. He says, perhaps the most important question of all, can human individuals and societies pursue reform by changing the external realities in human institutions, or does true reform begin by change in the inner moral life of persons born with a sin nature? These issues are the first principles that will separate a conservative who is oriented above to the transcendent, behind to the past, around about in the present, and then forward toward the future, from a progressive who rejects the reality or authority of the transcendent, turns his back on the past, and rushes toward the future with the certainty that progress is inevitable. And I think my concern is that too much of populism that we see today actually looks a little bit more like the past, maybe not turning its back completely on the transcendent, but maybe with a belief that just if the right people take over a few institutions, that will be enough. And it isn't. And it certainly isn't the way that Baptists or maybe even evangelicals more broadly have understood societal transformation in the past.
And what's curious too, Jesse, is, when I was growing up, and I grew up in a context where we were very involved in politics. We read, Be Salt and Light. We thought, okay, that it means go out and, support candidates and get involved in the political process, which I think is a wonderful thing for people to do. But we had reduced it to that. But growing up, the emphasis had always been on getting the right person into office. And the conversations centered around the question of character at that time. And I think what's revealing now is that many of the same people that I grew up with, that I heard this from, are now in a place where getting the right person into those positions of power has less to do with their character than the degree to which they maybe embody a resentment against, an elitism or a status quo. They're just looking for somebody to come and shake things up. And the question of character has kind of been put to the side. And to me, that's kind of been a revealing process as I've, gotten older.
Hey, let me add a little bit of complexity to this conversation. I think because this is what happens every time, the points that are being made here, I think we all agree with one another. And I think a lot of people would hear this conversation and say, well, you guys just don't want religion to have any role in the public square, right? You just want there to be a wall of separation, to use the Jeffersonian misused image. So I want to give you guys the opportunity how do you respond to that? Because I do think it's not helpful when we categorize in these oversimplistic ways where clearly you just want a secular state then, because that's not what I think. And I don't think that's been the historic Baptist position either. And so I'm curious what you guys would say to that critique.
I think that's a great point. So the critique then is, well, you all are, trying to go Anabaptist, you're just completely absenting yourself from the political process. And that's not what we're saying at all. To kind of bring together what Wilsey is saying about conservatism and your question is, our ultimate hope is in something transcendent. And do we think that we should be engaged in the political process? And do we think that rulers and leaders have a role to play, or there's a significant part that they have to play in society and the formation of society? Yes. But when we think about what is our ultimate hope, what is that baseline? it isn't ultimately for me in getting the right candidate in office. So that doesn't mean I abdicate that responsibility. I take it seriously, and I think that has a role to play. And I think Christians should maybe run for office, and I think Christian values and virtues should be promoted, even in the political sphere. But at the end of the day, I don't think societal transformation and change is going to occur because we have the right political candidate in office. So to me, it's more of a baseline question. What do you think the ultimate hope is? And for me, it's in the proclamation of the gospel and in the church and in conversion. And I think there's a political component, but like Wilsey says about conservatism, it's pre-political. There are things prior to that. And so the transcendent is something that comes first. And so I think there's a political component. I just don't think it's the whole thing. And that's my concern, is that it seems to, for some folks who would call themselves conservatives or call themselves Christians, that seems to be the most important part to them.
The other part too, that I what I tell people all the time is the greatest danger when you get involved politically is that you stop trusting in the weapons that we've been given as Christians. The typical pattern, there are exceptions to this, wonderful exceptions to this, but the typical pattern that I see are people, Christians, who dive into politics thinking that this is the key. This is where real power is. The sword, that's the real power. And, part of what I love about the Baptist movement, which, aimed to be a restorationist movement, is that it appreciates the testimony of the age of the martyrs, where you see real transformative power before Christians have, would have ever dreamed of, being entrusted with leadership in government or something like that. You have what we have is the truth. We have the power of witness. And that's how hearts are changed. That's how communities are changed. Cultures are changed. That's how ultimately the Roman Empire was turned upside down. And so I really do think that there's in many cases kind of a getting the cart before the horse. There's a way of engaging politics that decenters the church. And I think any healthy Christian political theology starts with the church, its role, and the unique authority and power that it's been given, which is a prophetic ministry, a witness to the truth. And then you go from there. And I totally agree with Jesse that when you start with politics, when you start with getting people into office, this is how we're going to change the world, you've stopped trusting in the weapons you've been provided. So
I would offer and say, if you look at the Baptist tradition, when I look at somebody like Isaac Backus, who is definitely concerned about political and civil matters in his, very precise arguments for why religious liberty should be given to Baptists, why there should be no forced taxes. Everybody has to pay for the minister's salary and so forth. But I do not think that Backus would want to be known simply as the guy that was talking about religious liberty. First and foremost, he was a preacher of the gospel. He traveled a lot of miles in churches throughout New England, later in the South, to preach and to build them up in Christ and to point them to the hope that we have in the Savior. I'll say this, for those that want to really brag about how much they believe in the sovereignty of God, practically, it often looks like they really don't believe in that, because they're always running to some cultural carnal weapon to use to achieve a goal, because patiently waiting on the Lord takes too long. That's too slow. That means I've got to rely on a power higher than me, not in myself. And I think that's one of the problems, is that we can pay lip service all day to these things, but how do we actually equip people, and what do we train them with? And so Casey said this was his favorite paragraph in the book. So now let's transition to, here's what Dr. Wilsey says, talking about this whole notion. Because we're not advocating, we're not advocating that we go into little, monasteries and hide ourselves from the reality of life. But here's the key.
And Jake, your reference to Bacchus, it reminds me that as those who defend religious liberty, we don't need to be the ones with the burden of proof for proving that we care about cultural engagement and changing the world. The reason Baptists promoted and died for religious liberty was so that the world could be. They looked at nominal Christianity, which is, fostered by this idea of the state church, and said that's not change. That's not conversion. And so to guard that, to actually make a way towards meaningful cultural change, they argued for something like religion is part of their mission. It wasn't a way of sort of protecting the world from, the Christian message. It was so that the real message could get out.
And
Yeah, I
I'll
mean,
go
if I want to
further.
go ahead.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I would just say I also want a Christian culture. I mean, I want that. I want our culture to be influenced as much as possible by Christianity. I just understand because of my Baptist convictions and the way the New Testament is written and worded in the covenant, it's not going to happen from the outside. It's not a top down. You cannot institute these values that way. You have to change hearts. You have to change lives. It's through the mission of the church. Any type of cultural Christianity has always been an accident of true conversion. I believe that. And I think if we lose that focus, then it's going to be very empty inside.
Well, I'll just roll this grenade into the conversation and say, I don't remember which historian it was that said it, but it becomes the truth is the Southern Baptist Convention became the Roman Catholic Church of the South. And one has to ask the question, on the whole, was that a good thing or a bad thing? And I think there's a lot of things that I can make a case for why that became a bad thing for a variety of reasons. But we've already talked about the new Christendom, and that's because the old Christendom was in Vienna and Rome and London. The new Christendom is going to be down there in Tennessee, not far from where Jesse lives. So we're all counting on him to be the
I'm just going
one
to
that gets it right.
I'm just going to assume you're talking about Welch College.
Yeah, well, yeah, yeah. And,
I mean, I'll speak a little personally on it. I mean, like, I don't think I would be a Christian if it weren't for cultural Christianity in the South, the Bible Belt culture. I mean, like, obviously, I'm talking about what God did and what he used, but like, I grew up understanding the gospel from an early age in a nominal Christian home because I was going to VBSs all the time with my neighbors and my cousins, and it surrounded me, right? And so, like, I do think there's something to be said there, but to try to just build that from the outside is just foolish to me. I mean, it's not gonna lead where people think it's gonna go.
I'm not entirely sure, Casey, though, that I would say that that's just cultural Christianity. I mean, what you described. So like that so many kids went to VBS, like, yeah, there's a cultural component. Not as many of, my neighbors who have kids go to VBS now. But like programs of the church that are intended to teach the gospel, preach the gospel, I wouldn't see that as cultural Christianity. So if you grew up in a nominally Christian home, maybe there's some elements of that there. But I think what you described is kind of like the evangelistic outreach and efforts of the church. So again, maybe the cultural component is if you had a nominally Christian family or more kids went to VBS.
The cultural component, what I was referring to was just that's what kids did.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just what you did,
Yeah.
and that was a good thing. That's a good habit that was embedded in culture kind of by accident, but because of the faithfulness of churches over generations, for sure.
Problem, though, is that I have to be careful because he may prove me wrong here, but Casey went to those VBSs that weren't using the King James Bible. See, that was where the issue was.
I don't know.
So,
I don't know. I'd be interested.
I did.
I know Winston did. Yeah. So,
I went to all kinds of VBSs. Some of them.
He went
to VBSs.
He was at the Church of Christ ones. Yeah. Okay.
I memorized my first verse to impress a girl. So there's the motivation.
Wow. Wow. Okay. Yeah.
I like that.
So,
hey, I was kind of wondering, Casey, did you feel slightly anxious when Winston said a restorationist movement earlier? I was just wondering if that Kentucky Campbellite thing kind of got you there.
I know what he meant.
Yeah.
I was able. The point he's making is right, but yeah.
So let me drop that word some more.
Yeah, yeah, all right, primitive. So let's think about this statement then, kind of how we're thinking about religion and politics. And Casey said this section of Dr. Woolsey's book was his favorite. Quote, that is, religion, let me give it in any alliance of religion and politics, politics loses nothing and religion loses everything. That is, religion loses credibility and influence in society because it becomes too closely associated with fleeting political trends of the day. What political issues seem today to be of apocalyptic importance, as in, this is the most important election in our lifetime, which the earliest election I can really remember following was 2000. I've heard that statement said for every one of them since then. In dire need of religious arguments to add weight to pragmatic or prudential considerations tomorrow are forgotten. In the meantime, politics goes on. New issues arise, but religion pays a cost. Once religion has become overly this worldly, distracted from its focus on God and his redemptive work to the extent that theology is downstream of political interest, it has become just another wind to be tossed aside and rejected when the moment passes. Now, I think this is so relevant because somebody sent me a statement that someone made that would be definitely involved in this new Christendom populist right movement, who was attending a very large gathering in Washington, D.C. that's been happening this week. And this individual is an SBC pastor, and he said, when I go to SBC events, all that I ever do is want to bang my head against the wall, and I think about everything that's wrong and discouraged. But going to this conservative gathering, I'm ready to run through a brick wall. This kind of conference is what the SBC needs. And to me, he's basically said, look, I mean, I have my critiques of the SBC, but I don't know how anybody can watch when missionaries are commissioned at the SBC every year and not remember what this is all about. That it really is about getting the gospel out. It is about planting churches. I don't hear that at all. That doesn't even enter into the mindset whatsoever, it seems to most of those engaged in these movements. And I think Dr. Woolsey is right that when you have brought these things together, by what people say, their lips betray their hearts, what they are consumed with. And it's why Andrew Fuller in his work on the backslider talks about that one of the evidence is that somebody is a backslidden Christian is they're consumed by political matters.
Yeah, he says that the word of God becomes a dead letter, while the speeches of the politicians become the lively oracles, which has always been stuck with me because when you wake up and I picture, the person getting online and what can't you wait to see? You can't wait to see the headlines or the Fox News debates or whatever. Yeah, I think that, there's some idolatry there. You could put it those terms as well.
Casey, we've moved past Fox News. It's Newsmax now. But yeah, so
sorry, I'm out of the loop.
Fox is too liberal these days.
I saw Newsmax is suing Fox News, so that's interesting. Say they have a monopoly on conservative.
Well, I know for a fact that Jesse is an avid watcher of the Tucker Carlson show, wherever that is streamed at now. That is where he's informed.
I just want to go on the record saying, I was saying many years ago, Tucker Carlson has some real issues, and people I was close to said, no, he says a lot of good stuff. I think he's real. There's a lot there. And I mean, I don't want a victory lap, but I'm just saying.
Was that Jake?
No, it was not me. No, I have never. I can be accused of many things. That's not one. The truth of it is, though, is Jesse primarily watches CNBC, but that's because he's consumed with the stock market. So,
man, I just watch CBN.
Is that where the 700 Club is still?
Yeah.
Or is it? Or are you talking about the Canadian Broadcasting Network?
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Hey, I'm just down the road from one of the locations of TBN. So, in fact, there's a giant Huckabee sign just down the road. Jake has seen it, where his show is recorded.
Hey, Mike Huckabee had the best book title. God, grits, gravy, and guns. I mean, it was kind of funny. He had the book out in 2008 when he lost all the weight. About he was eating more healthy and he got into running and all that. And then 5 years later, it was back to grits and gravy, baby. Get all that health stuff. So
I'm sympathetic.
Yeah, but yeah, I am too. But I think the point there is that this is the danger. Thinking about it from a big picture in Baptist life, we are by nature in our DNA a populist people. We're grassroots. We're from the bottom up, but we've always been tempered. I think we've been tempered by an emphasis on the eternal. That's why we were the people creating the mission societies and sending missionaries to foreign lands, to places that had no witness. I also think about some things that get forgotten about is in these early days, preceding Carey going to India and all, I mean, there were societies about the Baptist preachers going to the towns, going to the villages that didn't have a church, didn't have a pastor. So that has always been at the heart. And I think that's tempered us from going into this, crazed, mania over politics, understanding we do need solid institutions, not just in the sense of local churches, but things like seminaries, educational bodies, and denominationalism. And I think that's one of the things to kind of make it full circle. This book about the SBC post World War One is that Southern Baptists said we won the war, World War One, because it was fought over Baptist principles. Democracy triumphed over autocracy. And yet within the denomination itself, it transformed. Democracy died, bureaucracy was alive. And I was reading these minutes from the 1923 annual meeting, and somebody, bemoaned and said, only a handful of people get to actually talk that control the time. And I'm like, I'm sorry, is this 1923 or 2025? I've heard the same critiques today. So this is the tension we ever live with in Baptist life, which I think means we have to work at it. We can't actually just, sit back and be passive. We have to be active and not being consumed by an unbridled populism.
No, I agree. Going back to that quote by Dr. Wilsey, part of what I like about it is, and I think this has always been central to our sharp distinction between the church and the state, and that is what we have now. And this goes much deeper than just our current political situation. I think an argument could be made that ever since the rise of modern nation states, this has been the tendency, and that is that religion is seen as existing in service to the state. So whether you go so far as to have an official church state, or whether it takes the form that it does today, which is essentially, I think the anonymous person you mentioned is a perfect example of this. What's exciting to them? It's he sees the religious potential for politics, for the nation, and rather than seeing the church as institution established by God that stands in some ways above and over the state, witnessing the truth to the state, so that leaders who are called to serve in that area respond in a way such that they can now execute their office faithfully. What you typically will find are ways of manipulating Christian movements and Christian bodies and things like that in the service of some political agenda that you've already established prior to any consideration as to whether it reflects a traditional Christian ethic or values or beliefs at all. And so I think that distinction is so important for protecting that proper relationship to the state. The other thing, too, that I would say is in terms of the distinction between, say, conservatism and populism, is that populism, I think, shares with certain movements on the left, like, say, liberation theology, this idea that what it means to have a prophetic witness is there's just an assumption that there's always going to be this sort of perpetual struggle by those without power against those in power. And in many cases, there's not really anything constructive to say about how we move forward, about the idea that repentance might come and things could change. I do think that conservatism, even though it does emphasize the reality of human nature and the fact that all of our institutions are going to be at some level corrupted by that, there is kind of I think a greater appreciation for the fact that hierarchies are going to exist in any society, that every society is going to have an elite. And the idea that somehow you can just establish some kind of purely egalitarian society is it's just crazy. It's a recipe for oppression. But that what we need are virtuous elites, and that the church has an important function, not as a grievance community, but as a community who offers a transcendent hope and also the warning of judgment and the second coming of Christ, that it can speak to an elite and call them to fulfill the responsibilities that they have within a society for its flourishing as they use their resources, their power, their authority to serve those that don't have it. So I think there is a certain like healthy optimism that I think comes from a Christian perspective and that aligns pretty well with a conservative attitude and disposition.
I just always wonder when this topic comes up how much of the politicization of the church right now has to do with just really poor, low ecclesiology. Because I really think that if people understood what's really happening in the church and there was weight to it and discipline was happening faithfully and the word is being preached, not it becoming a platform for partisanship or whatever, then you're illustrating like this is actually where it really is. Like you're settling when you go to politics for change. The church's mission is where it's at, and I kind of think where we're at today is to some degree downstream from the drop off in Baptist ecclesiology, just speaking for Baptists, that we've just lost all that and churches are weak and discipline doesn't matter and you can just move your membership anytime you want anywhere and there's no accountability, etc.
I think that's really insightful. And so maybe we need to take the proclamation of the gospel more seriously. We need to take evangelism more seriously. We need to take membership and discipline more seriously. So maybe we're not presenting enough, compelling enough vision of the church because we're not following the commands of Scripture. So I think that's right to say maybe part of that is on us, is on the church.
Well, I think this has been a great conversation. I think we've covered a lot of good ground today, and I hope we'll kind of promote and stir up more conversations among those who are listening. To wrap up this episode, we are called the Quartet. So I kind of would like to ask each
You're
of
not
you
going to have us sing, are you?
Oh, no, I'm not going to have a sing. But I would like for you to each share maybe today or this week, what is a hymn or a song that's kind of really encouraged you today or through this week so far that maybe has just kind of come to your mind a good bit?
I'll go first because I have one fresh in my mind. In
Okay.
chapel at Welch College today, we sang "Ask the Lord that I Might Grow," and man, that's such a great song. It isn't immediately encouraging, maybe in the way that you might expect, but really excellent.
You got to sing all the verses to get that one. You can't,
And we did.
Yeah, it has a resolution, doesn't it?
yeah.
Well, this one's from a few weeks ago, but it's been stuck in my head since I thought of it. I asked our music leader to sing it following the sermon that I had preached because it related to the theme. But it's an old hymn called "I'd Rather Have Jesus." It's not terribly old, but if you're familiar with that, it goes through a list of all of the things that he would rather have Jesus than those things, and the story behind that is also pretty inspirational as well. So I encourage people to look up the lyrics, look up the story.
Then to be a king, have a vast domain, and be
Some of those
held in
notes-
sin's dark sway.
Some of those notes are a little high. You got to be ready.
They are. You got to be like George Beverly Shea. Yeah, you got to be able to hit that. So, all right, Casey, what about you?
My go-to is "On Christ the Solid Rock I Stand." That's the hymn that probably comes into my head at least once a week, usually when there's something chaotic happening around me in my life, and it's just always a comforting truth to remember where we stand.
Well, I've got two from today, so I can do this since I'm the MC of this show. The first one is that the chapel speaker made a reference to "I'll Fly Away Today," and so that took me back to my childhood because when I was a kid, that was my favorite hymn It was number 75 in the Maroon book that we used when I was growing up.
Did your feet leave the floor?
When we were singing it?
Today, I mean, did you just feel yourself beginning to elevate?
Well, my mind went back to when I was a kid. So when I was a kid, I wouldn't say fly away. I said fly away. I had, didn't pronounce it right. So I used to love to lead that song all the time. But then we closed with "There is a fountain," and just to think about that there, and all the things that we can be consumed with on this earth, that we can't forget there is going to come a day when this tongue will sing praise, and it will not just be by faith, but it will because our eyes now see the one who died for me. And so, yeah, so I think that's good for us to remember. So,
Amen.
Yeah.
If your
So I'm ready to
politics don't start there, it's not Christian. So
That's right, and
We could
I'm
have
ready
just started with that and called it a day.
yeah, I'm ready to give the altar call here now. So yeah, all right. Well, we hope all of you enjoyed listening to this latest installment of the Quartet, and I'm going to ask all of us to end this episode as we typically do by saying, "Stay Baptist."
Stay Baptist.